So, here's the question. Will I continue to use SteamOS for the foreseeable future, or am I going back to Windows? Hey all you data vendors, hardware vendors, and open source software vendors. My name's Spatsheep, and as most of you probably know, the Steam Deck has been out for a good while now. And as the slightly nerder portion of you may know, the Steam Deck runs its own custom Linux-based operating system called SteamOS. At first, this seems counterintuitive, right? Aren't 99% of the games on Steam designed to run only on Windows? Well, yes, but Valve had a lot of reasons why making their own operating system for the Steam Deck was actually an advantage. As a result of this, a lot of Valve's work went into creating open source compatibility tools to get all of those Windows games running well on Linux. And here's the fun thing, it doesn't just work on Steam games. It works on a lot of Windows software. As a result, a lot of Windows software now works really well in Linux. And thanks to a group of open source maintainers, we now have a version of Linux that includes all of Valve's tools pretty much out of the box. So the question is, can you daily drive SteamOS on your main PC? And is it actually better than Windows? And also, not just for gaming. There are plenty of videos out there showing how well certain games run on the Steam Deck, and there's an entire website out there, ProtonDB, which is designed for showing compatibility between different games and Linux. No, I want to cover every feasible consumer use case for a PC and see if Linux really is a viable alternative in 2023 for the average PC user. I don't have access to video chapters yet, so there'll be a bunch of timestamps right here so you can skip to the part that you're interested in. Although I am in desperate need for good watch time metrics, so maybe if you're just interested in this topic in general, maybe consider sticking around and watching the whole thing. If you've ever installed Linux on anything before, even just once, then this process will be something that you're used to. If not, there are plenty of tutorials out there showing you how to do it. You'll need a spare USB drive and the ISO file that you can download from the HoloISO GitHub. So, this was it. Day 0 of my challenge. I made sure to back up absolutely everything that I wanted to keep and shut Windows down for the final time. That's right, to make sure I didn't cheat, I obliterated Windows completely from my system and made a promise to myself not to use my Windows laptop unless it was absolutely 100% necessary. I booted into the installer and installed SteamOS. Everything's going well so far. The first thing I noticed after I installed wasn't good. My system was just completely unable to play any sound. Now, admittedly, I was kind of expecting this because I use a Go XLR. This is a pretty niche piece of kit that is designed for YouTubers and streamers and isn't really the sort of thing that most people would have installed on their system. But since I was having to do this challenge, it was a problem that I had to sort out. Thankfully, as we'll come to see as the start of a bit of a pattern, the open source community totally had my back on this. One install from the AUR later, and everything was working perfectly, even my microphone, which is good because, otherwise I wouldn't be able to record this video. My mouse, which I'm sure all of you will recognize from my most popular video, actually worked fine, with one pretty major exception. You see, Razer tends to use this weird proprietary input system for all of the non-standard buttons, which the open source community hasn't really been able to reverse engineer yet. Yes, there is technically a workaround, but it kind of requires Windows. Yes, I'm already resorting to using the Windows laptop, which I am not happy about, but given that these buttons aren't just a way of interacting with my system day to day, but are an incredibly important part of my editing workflow, I think this falls under the absolutely necessary clause that we discussed earlier. So, I downloaded Razer Synapse on my laptop, and then proceeded to map all of the buttons to the invisible F13 through F24 keys. Yes, there's a second row of invisible function keys that you don't see on pretty much any keyboard. Just don't worry about it. I then made sure that this profile was stored on the mouse's internal memory itself and not just on my system. And back in SteamOS, I used this mapping tool to map those keys to various macros depending on the profile. Kinda convoluted, but at least everything's working. All my other peripherals, like my keyboard and my camera, work just fine out of the box. Now we've got all that out of the way, we can move on to the part that I'm sure most of you have been waiting for. That's right, gaming. Now, this isn't going to be any kind of benchmark because that will depend on your system, your setup, plain luck, and also it'll be boring for me to record. This will just be my subjective experience in how well various games that I want to play work on my system. Let's start with a couple of recent games then. Starfield, when it's running, runs really smoothly. This was the first game I tried and I was impressed. Until I wasn't. Yeah, I don't know what it is with this game, but for some reason it seems to just spontaneously crash every 5 minutes or so, or whenever something kind of intense happens, like taking off from a planet. This is not really a good start, is it? Baldur's Gate 3 then. Now, that runs significantly better. I did have a weird graphical issue at first, but I was able to fix that by changing the anti-aliasing settings and then turning FSR upscaling off. My PC is able to handle this absolutely fine at 1080p and max settings, and I didn't notice any frame drops at all. Esports games. Now, those are kind of a mixed bag here in Linux. Overwatch 2 runs absolutely flawlessly out of the box, which, I mean, is surprising given how badly Blizzard treats its fans. If you're a Valorant or Apex player though, you are totally out of luck here. Both those games use super aggressive anti-cheats that just prevent the game from running on Linux at all. You've got absolutely no chance of those working anytime soon, if ever. Indie games though? Now those seem to be the exact opposite, with many of the most popular indie titles having native versions that run just flawlessly under Linux. And yes, I am still stuck on the final room of the Celeste DLC. Shout out to those of you who watched my streams back during the pandemic. That seems like a lifetime ago now. But you may have noticed something. All the games I've mentioned so far are available in Steam, and Steam are by far not the only distributor of games on PC. For those games, you can use something called Lutris, which supports GOG, the Epic Games Store, EA, whatever it is they call that, Origin, I think? Some games can take a little bit more work than others. Cyberpunk 2077, for example, which I owned through GOG, took a lot more tinkering than it would take if I had it installed through Steam. It completely wouldn't work when I installed it directly through Lutris, so I had to use Lutris to download the GOG client and then download Cyberpunk through the GOG client, but I couldn't launch Cyberpunk through the GOG client because then I would get this weird stuttering issue that wasn't a frame drop, it was more like the entire engine was just freezing. Yeah, it was a whole thing. Anyway, I realized I was able to add an already installed game inside Lutris, so I pointed that to the exe and that fixed the stuttering issue. Yeah, it's exhausting, I think is probably the word. Is it really worth all that effort just to get one game running? Well, that's up to you, but if you would like to avoid jumping through all those hoops, then maybe just stick to Steam for now? Okay then, what about console ports? Well, the Spider-Man games run absolutely flawlessly here on my TV. Wait a second, I'm playing this on my TV? Okay, let's talk about... Moonlight is a relatively popular piece of software that started out life as a client for Nvidia's game stream service and is now available on many devices. Even if you don't have an Nvidia graphics card though, another piece of software called Sunshine can act as a server, allowing you to stream games between your PC and basically any device. Once again, a single download from the AUR and a couple of settings configured in a browser, and I'm beaming games over my local network from my computer to my TV. It's just that simple. Sunshine can even stream your games over the internet if you really want to, but I haven't tried that. What, do I look like the kind of guy who goes outside? This can allow for some really fun and unique experiences, for example, like playing Jackbox party games with your friends while your PC is in a completely separate room, or coming home from a long day of work or school and playing something like Pokemon or Animal Crossing. Wait a second, Pokemon and Animal Crossing? It's no secret that emulation usually offers the best experience for all but the most demanding of console games, and while it's true that a lot of people see emulation and piracy as going hand in hand, it doesn't have to be that way. All of my emulator games I purchased legitimately from the Nintendo eShop, hacked my Switch, and ported the games over to my PC. I just prefer to emulate them because it gives me access to mods and 4K upscaling and all of that stuff that Nintendo doesn't allow you to do on their lockdown system. Also, they look really cool in my Steam library. Pretty much all emulators are open source anyway, so they're right at home here on Linux. The emulators I tried were Yuzu, Citra, Desmumi, and the famous Dolphin, because I was a Nintendo kid. Sue me. Actually, I definitely shouldn't joke about being sued in a video that mentions Nintendo and emulation in the same sentence. Okay, let's quickly move on from talking about systems of gaming's past and take a look at gaming's future. In general, setting up a VR headset isn't the most seamless or streamlined experience, even on Windows. I personally use the Oculus/Meta Quest 2, and while yes, that is a standalone headset, there are plenty of games that are only available on PC, and games like VR Chat that offer a much better experience on PC than they can on the tiny little XR2 chip that powers the Quest 2. Quest users who do use PC VR will likely be familiar with the official Airlink or the not so official virtual desktop app. On Linux though, it's a little bit different. The only solution is an open source program called ALVR. As it turns out, setup was actually not too difficult. Although, after changing a few settings like upping my bitrate and messing around with a few other things, it just would not relaunch for me. Thankfully, they have a great community and I was able to hop right into their Discord server, and I was quickly able to figure out from that it was my audio settings that were the problem. Yeah, it turns out that audio is completely busted right now, so you'll have to use your own wireless headset or earphones if you want any kind of sound. As long as you leave the audio settings alone though, you're free to pump up the resolution and bitrate as high as your hardware and network will allow. As for games, I tried Half-Life Alyx and VR Chat, both of which kind of terrify me for different reasons. Ah! this game, but they both do run really quite well. And if anything, the quality of the picture I'm seeing in my headset is actually better and less grainy than the image that I was getting through virtual desktop on Windows. Although that's likely down to me being an idiot back then and not realizing how to set up my own hardware correctly or something. I don't know. Okay, but what good is gaming if you can't use your PC for other more general applications too? Otherwise you might as well just buy a console, right? That's where things get significantly easier. Easier in fact than Windows even. Recently, a new format of app on Linux has exploded in popularity, that being the Flatpak. Instead of going to an app's website and downloading an installer like you would do on Windows, SteamOS offers visual access to all of FlatHub. This means that you can install pretty much any major browser, Discord, Teams, Zoom, Spotify, VLC, the aforementioned Lutris, and basically all the emulators we talked about earlier as well. Pretty much any general task you can think of, with a couple of notable exceptions. There's a Flatpak for it. But just because you can install something doesn't necessarily mean you should. Let's talk about the interesting ecosystem that is Office apps on Linux. You might have noticed that in the previous section I said with some notable exceptions. And yeah, it's a pretty well known fact that the Microsoft Office suite, that being Word, Excel, PowerPoint, aren't available on Linux. And with those words, I just felt everyone who didn't know that click off this video, but please don't, because there really are some viable alternatives. There is of course Microsoft's own online version of Office, which is completely free to use and is perfectly good for simple tasks, and you can even install it as a web app to your system as well. The biggest open source competitor to Microsoft Office is LibreOffice, and hey, that's gotta be better since I last tried it out in like 2014, right? It's been a decade since then. LibreOffice, what the hell do you call this? So, to be fair, LibreOffice isn't actually that bad if you're writing a document from scratch. The thing is, a lot of people who use Microsoft Office, and especially Word, don't use it like that most of the time. If you're the kind of person who needs to collaborate on documents, or you get templates or forms to fill in from your work or school, then LibreOffice is going to cause some pretty frustrating issues for you. But wait, there is another. This is WPS Office. It's not open source, but it is free to use and seems to have significantly less issues than LibreOffice. It also has a very handy built-in export to PDF feature, which works far better than print to PDF, which is a pain in the ass to set up under Linux. Whichever Office suite you go with though, I highly recommend the first thing you do is install a font called Carlito and set it as your default. This font was originally made by Google for the Chromebook and is designed so that every glyph takes up exactly the same amount of space as its counterpart in Calibri. That way, when you open a document that was made with the default font in Microsoft Word, you don't get the weird formatting issues with text taking up more or less space than it should. And for those of you right now who are saying, why not just install Calibri? Well, it turns out that Microsoft is weirdly overprotective of that font and only distributes it in Windows and as part of Microsoft Office. Just as a bit of a tangent, for those who like to manage their productivity outside of the general Office applications, I use Thunderbird for managing my emails. It's free, it's open source, and it's made by Mozilla, the same people who made Firefox. It took a bit of tweaking the settings to get it how I like it, but it works really well. Notion is available on the AUR, which is the app that I use for managing my productivity day to day, including all of my YouTube video scripts. I highly recommend though that instead you install the Notion Enhanced package, which fixes a few bugs just present in the Notion package. On that note though, I am getting a little bit tempted to migrate all of my stuff from Notion into Obsidian, which is open source and uses Markdown, which means I get to manage all of my files myself instead of relying on someone's cloud somewhere. And if anyone watching uses Obsidian, I would really like you to try and convince me down in the comments below. But once you're done making all those files, where do you put them? Well, I installed both OneDrive and Nextcloud. Those are the two off-system storage locations that I use. The Nextcloud client is the nicer of the two with these sync icons that show in my file explorer. The OneDrive client also works, I just wish that its interface was as nice as with Nextcloud. Now we come to a topic that is incredibly relevant to me, that being creativity applications. After all, I need to edit this video, right? So how exactly am I doing that? Well, my editor of choice is DaVinci Resolve, and that's because it's free and is incredibly powerful once you get to know how to use it properly. There is a native Linux version, but it's designed for Debian and Ubuntu-based systems, which makes things a little bit trickier because SteamOS is based on Arch Linux. Once again though, the AUR comes to the rescue, with packages being available for both the free and the studio versions, with a few caveats. The first, and this is a small one, is that I had to actually restart my PC when installing this thing to avoid this weird white splash screen. This is pretty rare for anything in Linux. You barely have to restart for any reason at all, and I have no idea what was causing this, but a restart seemed to fix it. The second issue, and this one is substantially bigger, is that MP4 files just do not work for whatever reason. This means that you have to convert MP4 files into something else first using a tool like FFmpeg. And me, being the giga nerd that I am, I've added this context menu option that converts entire folders of MP4 to MOVs so I can import them into DaVinci Resolve quickly. Another weird issue I encountered is that audio just doesn't work out of the box. I had to install a package called Pulse Audio Alsa, which I think is designed for a completely different thing, some sort of audio server, which you don't have to set up. It's just installing that package for whatever reason brings in the dependency that DaVinci Resolve needs in order for audio to work. And finally, the biggest caveat is that in the most recent release, the Fusion tab is completely busted, and for me, this is kind of a disaster. Whenever I try to do anything in the Fusion tab or open a project that has Fusion edits, the whole program will crash instantly. Just to be clear, editor plugins that use Fusion effects still work absolutely perfectly for whatever reason, so if most of your editing is done in that way, then you're probably going to be fine. Me personally though, I really enjoy messing around with Fusion to create cool transitions or effects when making my videos, and if I stick with this, then my editing is going to have to be more simplistic until this gets fixed. I do have my fingers very firmly crossed that this is going to be resolved soon, and there are even a few whispers that DaVinci Resolve might be being made a Flatpak, which if true would be a massive win for video editing on Linux because you'd be able to use it in any distro without any issues. Moving on from video to image editing then, this is where things start to really fall down for me. I use the Affinity Suite for making all of my YouTube thumbnails and the logos for all of my projects, which officially is only available on macOS and Windows. And despite there being several guides out there for getting it to work through Bottles or Lutris or Proton, I just cannot get past the splash screen. People have been asking in the Affinity forums for literal years at this point for some kind of Linux support, and the devs just do not seem interested. These messages get shot down every time. I guess I'm gonna have to figure out how to use GIMP, which, I mean, let's be honest, might be fine for YouTube thumbnails, but is sorely lacking in features compared to the Affinity Suite or for something like Photoshop. Speaking of which, I personally don't use Adobe products. I mean, come on, have you seen those prices? But from what I've read online, getting that installed is just as hard, if not harder than the Affinity Suite. So, for those of you who use that, there's not really much luck for you either. For those of you into digital painting though, there is Critter, which is open source and is supposed to be really good actually. I can't personally verify this because I have absolutely no idea about that side of digital art, but maybe it's something worth trying out. As for audio, I don't use a separate audio editor for any part of my video making process, although it is useful to have Audacity or one of its more open forks installed for the occasional time you might need it. From what I've read, both FL Studio and Ableton Live work pretty well in Linux with hit or miss plugin support, which, from what I understand about the music making progress, is kind of a massive deal. So if you want to try it out, maybe it'll work for you, maybe not. Again, I can't verify it because I guess I just can't be good at everything, unfortunately. Talking of not being very good at things, I am not very good at 3D modeling. However, I bought a 3D printer anyway, so get subscribed if you'd like to see me make use of that. Right now, I'm using Onshape as my 3D editor, which is browser-based, which is great because that means it works on everything. Blender, of course, is another really big piece of 3D modeling software, and that's open source, so of course is right at home here on Linux. I could be interested in learning how to use Blender for both 3D printing stuff and maybe also some VR-based projects. Let me know down in the comments if you'd like to see anything like that, because while I feel like it could be interesting, I feel like I'd also have to learn a lot in a relatively short amount of time. As for the more professional 3D design tools though, like Maya and SolidWorks, those are a complete no-go on Linux for now. So if you use those, you're kind of out of luck. When it comes to actually 3D printing models, I was able to get Bamboo Studio to work just fine. Just make sure if you're installing it that you install the bin package and not the other one because it took ages to install and then failed to open for me. I also tried to get Orca Slicer to work, which is a fork of Bamboo Studio and is supposed to be better, but I had the same issues as with the original Bamboo Studio package. It just wouldn't open for some reason. For those of you with other printer setups, I'm sure you're already used to tinkering 24/7 to get things to work. So I'm not going to insult your intelligence, you're almost certainly smarter than I am. Programming? On Linux? Literally what it's designed for. 11 out of 10. So, here's the question. Will I continue to use SteamOS for the foreseeable future, or am I going back to Windows? Well, I think if you know me, then you'll know the answer. I am absolutely down to keep using SteamOS for the foreseeable future. Whether you should do the same though, very much depends on you as a person and what you want from your PC. It's very clear to me that Linux on the desktop has improved massively since I last tried it out. Valve's contribution to gaming on Linux has turned one of Linux's worst use cases into one of its best, and it's only going to get better and keep on getting better faster from here on out. For those of you that want a good productivity or office type setup, I think Linux is 95% of the way there. The only reason you shouldn't use it is if you're reliant on some obscure Microsoft Office feature or macro, or you're in a team that is deeply embedded in the Microsoft ecosystem for collaboration. There are still some improvements to be made, and there are definitely some differences to get used to, but I feel like once you do, you'll definitely be able to have a really good experience here. Where Linux still falls down though is in creativity applications. The lack of professional class, picture or video editing software, and huge issues in those that do exist will mean that you're probably better off not switching for now if what you do on a day-to-day basis relies on that kind of software. I'm only sticking with it because, well, I guess I'm just a bit of a masochist who really enjoys making life harder for myself, but also because I was really starting to hate my experience in Windows. I think that over the next few years, as Linux improves and Microsoft continues to make the customer experience in Windows worse, we'll see a lot more interest from the general public in the alternatives that Linux can provide. It'll start with gamers, as it already has with the Steam Deck, and developers will be forced to reconsider ignoring the Linux ecosystem. Let me know down in the comments if you think I've missed anything. I've been Spatchy, and remember, you don't just have a right to repair, it is right to repair. Thanks for watching.